Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about some great albums from the 90s that are long overdue to get reissued on vinyl. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. Vinyl records went through this big shift in the 90s. The albums that were released earlier in the decade, most of those were pressed on vinyl, even though some of them were more limited. And then as the decade went on, it became more and more rare for those albums to be pressed on vinyl. And for a lot of them, it wasn't until after the vinyl revival started in 2008, 2009, it really wasn't until like the early part of the 2010s when you saw a lot of those albums from the 90s finally getting pressed on vinyl. But there's a lot of albums from the 90s that have been pressed since they were first released in the 90s. And at this point, with as popular as records are, the only thing I can think of is there has to be some kind of licensing issue because bands and labels are just leaving money on the table. One of the most requested albums to get repressed on vinyl has to be Alice in Chains Unplugged. It was released in 1996, and the album did get reissued in 2010 by Music on Vinyl. They did a standard black pressing, which is the one I have. They also did a colored pressing of that album. And then there's been nothing since 2010. If you want to go back and pick up a copy of that 2010 pressing, you're going to spend probably somewhere between $200 and $400 for it. I've long considered it one of the greatest live albums of all time. And it's one that I'm glad I grabbed a copy of this because it was probably like 2018. I saw it in the record store a couple of times, and I want to say it was like almost $40, a little over $40, and I thought that was a lot for an album. So I looked at it a couple times, ended up not buying it. And then finally one day I was like, look, I'm just going to grab a copy of it. And I'm glad I did because that was the last time I ever saw a copy of it in the wild. And it was probably like 6 months later I hopped on Discogs and was shocked to see it was already going for like over $150 at that time. But Alice in Chains has been good about doing anniversary reissues over the last couple of years. So this is one that I think we'll probably see an anniversary reissue of it next year. But as popular as this album is, I'm surprised it wasn't done years ago. Another one from Alice in Chains that I think we're going to get this year is their self-titled album. It came out in 1995. It was the band's third studio album, and it was the last album of Layne Staley. And this is one of those albums that it was only pressed when it was first released in 1996, and we've seen nothing since then. This one's like $300 to $500 on Discogs. This is one I can almost guarantee we're going to get a reissue of it. I think either late this year because November marks the 30th anniversary of the album. So I think late this year or maybe early part of next year. Another album I'm really surprised has never been reissued since it was first released is Apple by Mother Love Bone. It was released in 1990, and this has to be probably one of the top albums that have had unofficial pressings over the years. I think I've seen probably at least 20 different pressings of this one. And this is another one of those instances where as popular and as influential as this album is, it's got to be some kind of licensing issue. And this is another one of those albums I have not seen in the wild in years. And like I said, it is a very influential album. This is the album that influenced a lot of those other Pacific Northwest bands in the early part of the 90s. It was released a couple of days after Andy Wood's death. And now that it's been, 35 years since the album was released, this is one that hopefully will get reissued sooner rather than later. One of my favorite late 90s skate punk albums. This is one that I know will never get pressed on vinyl. It was never released on vinyl. It was only released on CD. And that is Adult Cabaret by Slimer. It came out in 1999. I actually saw the band on Warped Tour that year, and it was one of my favorite performances that year. I picked up their CD, and I love this album. I get it. Slimer is one of those bands that, they were on Warped Tour that year, and you pretty much never heard from them again. So it's very unlikely this one ever gets pressed on vinyl, but, it's one I'd love to see happen. And then there's an album like Antichrist Superstar by Marilyn Manson. Came out in 1998. This is one of those albums where I thought for the longest time we would see a reissue of this one. It was pressed on vinyl in 1998. There was a reissue in 2006. I think it was only on picture disc. Then there was a Hot Topic exclusive from 2013. I think it was limited to like 1,500 copies. Sells for several $100s now if you can find a copy of it anywhere. I think the reason this one hasn't been reissued is all the allegations around Marilyn Manson. Mechanical Animals is another one of those albums that hadn't been reissued in a very long time. And I think it was, 2 years ago, it was going to get reissued. I think it had been pressed and sent to record stores. And then a couple of days before it was supposed to be released, the label, the distributors all pulled them, requested all the albums be shipped back to them. There were a few of them that made it out to market, It had already been ordered and released and shipped to customers. So there are some copies that have been floating around from that pressing, but most of them never saw the light of day. And when that happened with Mechanical Animals, I knew at that point, Antichrist Superstar was just never going to get repressed. One album that I'm absolutely shocked has not been reissued at this point is Aenima by Tool. It was released in 1996, and there were pressings in both 96 and 97, but nothing since then. And it's crazy. If you go on Discogs, original pressings of this album sell for somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000 to $3,000, which is absolutely insane for an album. But the crazy thing is, I heard an interview from somebody that's involved with the art and packaging for Tool's albums, and said that everything for this repress had been done and ready and just waiting on the band's approval and for the album to get pressed. And that was from 2019. So this is something that's going to eventually get repressed. But, it's really anyone's guess at when that's going to happen. An album I was really surprised wasn't reissued for Record Store Day this year is Astro Lounge by Smash Mouth. It was released in 1999. It's never been available on vinyl. I think it was last year, or might have been the year before, that they reissued Fu Shumeng. Actually, I think it might have been 2022. So it's been a few years since that album got pressed. So I kind of thought we'd see it last year. And then when it didn't happen, I thought we'd see it this year for Record Store Day. Maybe we'll see a Black Friday pressing of it. And it's an album that's popular enough to easily sell at least, I'd say, 5,000 or 6,000 copies of it. Of course, also with the unfortunate passing of Steve Harwell, maybe that'll kind of influence the band and the label to finally press this album. Another one of those great punk albums from the 90s that probably no one out there remembers, and very few people, I think, bought a copy of it when it was originally released. It's one that will never see a light of day. It'll never get pressed on vinyl. Is Songs We Didn't Write by Goaty Hook. It was just a fun covers album by a great punk band, but they covered songs by the Penguins. There's Joan Jett songs on there. They covered an X song. I think they also did Violent Femmes. There's even a great cover of Burnin' Love by Elvis Presley on there. I've loved this album since it first came out, and it's one, like I said, I'm sure this will never get pressed, but I'd love to see it happen. And for the most part, I'm not a fan of covers and cover albums, but this is one I've loved for a really long time. Something that did recently get reissued. It came out in 2023. It was a Japanese pressing. It was super limited. No one heard anything about it until it dropped, and it sold out almost instantly. Is the self-titled album from Coverdale Page. It was released in 1993, and that was the only time it was pressed until 2023, the Japanese pressing, which you can still get a copy of it off Discogs for, I want to say it's like right around $100, so it's not like super expensive like some of these other albums are, but this is one of those albums where, I think it's kind of one of those great sleeper albums from the 90s. It was a fascinating collaboration between David Coverdale and Jimmy Page, and it's got that that bluesy hard rock sound of Whitesnake, blended in with the incredible guitar playing of Jimmy Page. And the end result was a really fascinating, unique sound. And over the years, it's become one of those cult classic albums. And staying with Jimmy Page, Page and Plant No Quarter from 1994 is another one that is long overdue to get reissued. And that No Quarter performance is easily one of the most anticipated reunions in music history. It was a reimagining of a bunch of Led Zeppelin tracks. They also threw in a couple of new ones also. And last year was the 30th anniversary of this album, so I thought we'd see it last year, but still a year later and still nothing. But this is one of those albums that kind of pops up in the wild every now and again. I think it's probably been maybe 6 or 7 months ago, I saw a copy of this at one of my local record stores. I almost bought it. It actually wasn't priced terribly, but I decided to pass on it in hopes that eventually this will get reissued. And on the heels of the last Black Sabbath performance and Ozzy Osbourne's retirement, there's a couple of great Ozzy albums that are long overdue also to get repressed. One of which is Osmosis, came out in 1995. It did actually get reissued. I think it was 2021 when this did get reissued. It was a South Korean pressing. I think there was only 500 copies of it that were pressed. Another one was where, it was reissued quietly and immediately sold out. But Osmosis was kind of a turning point for Ozzy. It's this darker, melodic, almost like industrial sound on that album, which is very different than what he'd done earlier. And even though it's got a couple of classic Ozzy tracks on there, I think it's one of those albums in his catalog that gets a little overlooked. I guess it did also get reissued as part of the See You on the Other Side box set a couple of years ago, but there's a lot of people out there that couldn't drop $500, $600, $700 on that box set and just want a copy of that album. And now that they just recently reissued Scream for the first time, hopefully we'll start seeing some of those long out-of-print albums from Ozzy get reissued, including Speak of the Devil, because I'd love to see a reissue of that one also. Another Ozzy album that I think they could do some really cool stuff with is Live and Loud. It came out in 1993. It was pressed in 1993. It was also part of the See You on the Other Side box set. But that's it. There's never been any other pressings of it. It's one of my favorite live albums of all time. And as you can see with the See You on the Other Side box set, they do some really cool stuff with packaging. So if they did a box set of Live and Loud. You know, they could do, this is the original CD version of it. They could do the front cover with the metal grill that's on this. They could package that with a 4K version of the concert film also. Because it is a 4 LP album, you know, I think they'd have to do something special for it to, you know, make people want to justify paying the price for it. Another album that's long overlooked, and actually the band kind of pretends like this album doesn't even exist, is the self-titled album from Motley Crue, released in 1994. It was Motley Crue's only album with John Corabi on vocals, and when this album was released, fans and critics absolutely tore it apart. But, you know, looking at this album now, you know, 30 years later, you know, is this the best Motley Crue album? No, but it's a lot better than I think a lot of people say it was. I think that Corabi era, as short as it was, I think it really needs to be revisited. Especially when you look at all the other albums from Motley Crue that have been pressed, you know, literally like 4 or 5 times over the last 6 years. And then there's nothing for this one. And it is an album that did get pressed when it was first released. There's a European pressing of it out there. If you want a copy of that, you're going to spend, you know, well over $300 for it. And as much as I like this album, I couldn't drop anything close to that on it. And then the last album I got on my list is one that was released in 1993. It was pressed on vinyl in 1993, but I think it was only ever released as a picture disc, is Thrall Demon Sweat Live by Danzig. And the album's a EP/live album hybrid, with the first half of the album, or the first side of the album, being Thrall, and I think there's 3 or 4 new songs on that. 3 or 4 new studio tracks are all recorded live in the studio. And then the last half of the album is live material. At least 4 of the 5 tracks are live, recorded during the Halloween performance in 1992. But the very last song on there is a remixed version of Mother, which was on Danzig's self-titled album from 1989. And it was actually this version of that song that the video on MTV got a bunch of airplay from and boosted the significance of Danzig and the popularity of that song and his music. So if you've ever heard the song Mother, you've probably heard the 1993 version over the 1989 version of it. But I guess along with that, you can throw in pretty much all the other early Danzig albums, which have never been reissued. So this is another one where we'll probably never see this one actually get an official reissue. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are some great albums released in the 90s that are long overdue to get reissued or have never been available on vinyl before. Because this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of other great ones out there. And there were even more than this. You know, over the last couple of years, we've started seeing more and more of those 90s albums get reissued for the first time or get pressed for the first time. So hopefully that's kind of a growing trend, and we'll see that continue on over the next few years. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.